Hello, everybody. I want to introduce you to child welfare. So let's get started. All right. So here we go. All right. So before I begin, I want to make sure that make it clear to you that so that you can understand that this lecture is going to be a little bit different than most of them because this is an area that I have worked in extensively and a system that I know a lot about. So whereas most of our lectures, the PowerPoints are basically from the publisher, and I kind of explain and narrate through them for you. This one is a little bit different. I've added quite a bit to it. It is quite a bit longer than most of the ones, but I have also taken out a lot of the publisher's information. Remember that for your exam, you are going to be asked primarily about what the publisher uh, puts in the book. So just make sure when you're studying that you understand what's in the book. That being said, there's a very good chance that I'm also going to ask you some questions about some of the additional information that I've added in here about how child welfare works in California and sort of what the system is in general and that sort of thing. So without further ado, let's get started. All right. So first we need an overview of what we're talking about here. Here are some statistics, some fairly old, but basically still the same statistics about children in care. Foster care, the term foster care is a little bit of a misnomer. I think that you need to be careful about how that's defined. We're going to talk about that a little bit later, but not all children who are involved in the child welfare system are in foster care. Foster care literally refers to an out-of-home placement in a foster care situation. And there are other kinds of out-of-home placements, and also you can be involved in the child welfare system and still be with a parent. So there's that. 100,000 plus kids waiting for adoption. That refers to the kids that are freed for adoption or on the adoption track or something along those lines. Again, that leaves, more than three quarters of which are still in some sort of service trying to get back together with their parents. The average age is 8.7 years old. I feel like this is probably a little bit misleading because there are a lot of really little kids in care, like under threes and under fives. And there's also a lot of, older teenagers in care. So I feel like doing an average age of 8.7 years gives you the picture that like, the mode is 9-year-olds, and that's just not the case. Okay, the average length of stay, again, nationwide, 20 months. I'm not sure what the number is for this on California. I'm guessing it's less. All right, so most minority groups are hugely overrepresented, but the African American youth that is by far the biggest problem for them. You have an entire other lecture that you're supposed to be watching this week about exactly this topic. I highly suggest that you watch it. It is very likely to appear on your exam, and it is very important. 20% of all youth in care will be homeless after 18. Again, nationwide, I feel like this is probably less in California. We have some systems in place that work to prevent this, but it is still very, very high. Okay, so I'm not going to kind of bang away at this too hard. You know what the situation is here about this. You really need to take a systems view when you're dealing in child welfare. You cannot just focus on the kid and you cannot just focus on the parent. It's an entire system. You need to focus on the whole family. I can't emphasize this enough. You're not going to be successful if you don't. Okay, so very briefly, if you did the reading, you have seen all of this. Um, I have kind of rejiggered it a little bit, but basically, child welfare in general is like the umbrella term for all of this, but the child welfare system is about like all the laws and all the mandates and all the requirements and all of this stuff. And I added the emphasis here on preventing the unnecessary separation of children from their families. We're going to come back to this and kind of discuss what that means and all of this, but like and how child welfare kind of failed at this for a really long time. But it's important to remember that this is like a top priority of child welfare in modern times, and we're still fighting against the beliefs of basically the general population around the kind of belief that it continues to be the goal of the system to remove children from their families, and that just is not the case. Okay, so CPS is kind of the blanket and umbrella term for the agency that is involved in delivering these child welfare services. So not all places call it CPS. We happen to do that here in California. Okay, so there's a lot more than these, but this is a lot of the current salient issues. I would say that in every kid that there's trauma. Every single kid just coming into care, being involved in the system, is traumatic. So just on that basis alone, every single one of these kids experiences trauma. They might, and by definition, they're survivors of maltreatment of some kind. Oh, well, I guess that's not entirely true, but okay, the huge majority of them are survivors of maltreatment of some kind. We'll come back to that when we talk about WIC 300. So anyway, not all of these apply to every single kid, except again, trauma applies to every single kid, even if they were removed at birth and never experienced, trauma of a direct type. Being removed from your mother at birth is a trauma. Okay, so values and ethics. I just want to pause on this a little bit. We've covered this topic a bit, and I want to make sure that if you have any interest in going into child welfare at all, that these things are something that you really take very seriously, because it is very easy to get really jaded in child welfare. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't have your guard up in some way, but you also need to be open to the idea that not every case is the same. Part of respecting the dignity and uniqueness of the individual is that they are unique, and you might hear the same story 10 times, but the details are going to be different, right? Like the petition might look the same, the facts of the case might look very much the same, but it's unique, it's different, it's a different family, different dynamics, different children, different parents, and you got to remember that, because the second you start thinking oh, this case is exactly like this other case that I had last month, you're not going to be doing the case that you're working on right now a service. You're going to be hurting that family. So just kind of keep that in mind. And respect for self-determination and everything. There are systemic issues that kind of stand in the way of families who live in poverty, who are more likely to be involved in the child welfare system. There are just more barriers for these families, just in general. And it's really important that as social workers, we walk the line between doing things for the families and teaching families how to learn skills and find resources for themselves. So, you know, like it's very paternalistic to do things for families when they can do those things themselves. Now, does that mean you just set them loose and tell them, you know, you're on your own? No, it's a little bit like school in the sense that, you know, like I give you assignments, but if you don't know how to complete the assignment, it's incumbent upon you to come back and to ask me a question about it, and I will help you. It's the same kind of concept. Okay, so I think we covered this a little bit on the last slide. Okay, so maltreatment. I got to tell you, when you actually work in CPS, you don't actually hear this word that much. The word that you hear is abuse or neglect, which I guess is more words, but like maltreatment is the umbrella term for all of this. Okay, so we are gonna kind of go off a little bit onto best interest of the child and minimum sufficient level of care. You're not going to find this in your book. But if you don't understand this concept, you do not understand how the child welfare system works. You just don't. So it's really, really important that you understand this concept, because otherwise the decisions that are made are not going to make any sort of sense at all. Like, yeah. So let's see if we can kind of piece some of this together. Okay, so this concept is really, really important. So it basically means that when a child is in need of protection, the state has an obligation to do that. And the way that we do that is through the court. And the court is tasked with making decisions in the best interest of the child, as though the court is the parent of the child. So embedded in every decision that the court makes is the best interest of the child. That's the sort of concept. Okay, so minimum sufficient level of care. So you will often find good social workers in child welfare reminding each other that this is our standard, that we are not looking for parents to be like amazing or perfect, or, you know, the kind of parents that we would want, or the kind of parents that like we are to our children, or anything like that. We are looking to make sure that the children's basic needs are met and that they're not being harmed. Okay, so like not being harmed is not the same as like being enriched, right? So there's a difference between, you know, buying baby Mozart everything and which is enrichment, right? And just setting them in front of the TV to watch, you know, Sesame Street, which, by the way, is what my child watches. The Sesame Street is wonderful. But the point that I'm making here is that, like, you know, basic needs and not being harmed does not mean that you provide them every single thing that money can buy. That's not what that means. What that means is that they're not being abused, they're not being neglected. That's what that means. So the reason why this is the standard is because there is just a huge body of research that shows that a birth family, and I don't just mean parents here, but like, you know, the family that you come from, the blood relatives that you have, as long as they're meeting the minimum sufficient level of care, those children have better outcomes than being placed outside of their family, even if the place where they're placed is amazing, even if that family has access to amazing schools and lots of baby Mozart and all of that stuff. So why would this be? I mean, if you think about it, if you think about how important those ties are to our family members, to our siblings, to our parents, to our cousins, like in terms of knowing who we are, where we came from. It's not just about the quality of the relationships, although that is a big part of it. It's not just about that. It's also about like, you know, having a sense of history, having a sense of belonging, and also those people feel an obligation to take care of you, right? For better or worse, those people feel like, well, you know, you're my blood relative. I guess I'm stuck with you. And there's some real value to that, because you know, when kids are abused or neglected, often they have some really challenging behaviors or challenging needs. And when you have family that feels obligated, you have a much easier time of dealing with all of that than putting them in a foster family who doesn't know the kid and does not feel obligated to the kid, and is like, this is not worth my time. It just is not worth the trouble. Okay, so before I move on, the best interest of the child is the child's attorney's priority. So in child welfare, everybody's got a lawyer. The county has a lawyer. The child has a lawyer. Each parent have lawyers, because they both have different interests. And sometimes there's just one parent, and sometimes there's two parents, and sometimes there's more than two parents. So everybody's got an attorney, and they all have different, you know, priorities. But the child's attorney's priority is the child's best interest. But CPS, right, Child Welfare Services, is concerned with this minimum sufficient level of care. That's what we care about in child welfare services. So, you know, sometimes that's the same and sometimes it's not the same. And when you get into trouble is when you're talking about when they're not the same. And like, remember, like what that translates to is this thing in blue is like trying to remember and emphasize that kids are better off in their family. You know, as long as they're not being abused and neglected, kids are better off in their family. Now, so how can that come to be some sort of conflict? Well, you know, the child's attorney, for example, or their court-appointed special advocate, their CASA, or, you know, people like that, the judge maybe even, can believe that, you know, the child's best interests, even though, you know, maybe the birth family does meet the minimum sufficient level of care, that, you know, they've been with this, you know, foster family for a while. It's a great foster family they want to adopt. They might think, you know, for this individual child, the thing that is in their best interest is to have them adopted there. And, you know, sometimes that's true, you know, just because the statistics say that, you know, 85% of the time option A is the correct one, well, there's still 15% of the time when option B is the correct one. So, you know, like, this is why we have a court system. This is why everybody has lawyers, so that we can kind of argue this all out. Okay, so basically the priority is to return the removed child as soon as the home is safe. So, you know, again, remember, the family is going to lead to better outcomes overall, as long as they're meeting the minimum sufficient level of care on the large. So, like, it's the goal of child welfare services to return the child as soon as possible. And again, like I said before, there's a lot of misconception out there about this. It's like, oh, you know, children are removed, they're never returned. That's happened, but the goal was always to try to remove, or to try to replace the kid to their home, always. And if they weren't, it was because they couldn't be, right? Okay, so here's kind of a multitude of reasons about why minimum sufficient level of care. I'm just going to let you read them through. So I'm going to focus on a couple of things here. which is it protects from individual biases and value judgments, and it's culturally appropriate. We're gonna come to that very, very shortly here. So the real life example, Native families prior to 1978. So think about what the stereotypes are about child welfare. They came from somewhere, and where they came from was, you know, how child welfare used to be, which is, you know, very much from the cultural value perspective of basically middle class white ladies. And you know, from that perspective, you know, child welfare was expecting to see children who had, you know, an adult as a parent figure, were wearing shoes, had formal education, all of that. Well, you know, in a lot of Native cultures, those are not things that are super highly prioritized. And so like the conditions were viewed from the you know, middle class white lady perspective to be a problem, to be problematic. And like what that led to was, prior to 1978, more than a quarter of all Native American children were removed from their homes and placed in non-Indian families. So think about this, okay? Like think about how devastating that is to the Native cultures in question. It is hugely damaging. And, you know, it just kind of erases a giant chunk of entire generations of children. It's horrific. So, and an acknowledgement that this was like not okay. In 1978, Congress passed ICWA, and to basically make it much harder to you know, remove children based on, you know, we don't like your how your culture runs. It is very ICWA is a very heavy law. There are a lot of parts to it. It is very difficult to work with when you're working within the child welfare system, especially if you are not like an ICWA specific social worker. There's just a lot of additional requirements and things with regard to how it works. And, you know, adoptions and placement requirements and foster care requirements and all of that stuff. So like, however, though it has a lot of onerous stuff in it, and if you Google it, you can find a lot of examples of where ICWA was used in a way that doesn't really feel like it's in the best interest of the child. I'm not going to weigh in on those examples, so please don't ask me. I'm not going to give you my opinion on any one particular example, but you can Google them. And you know, the questions that I pose here at the bottom are thought questions for you to consider, and I want you to think about them carefully, because again, you have exams. All right, so if you want to learn more about ICWA, full disclosure, I have not read this book. It is fiction. I hear it is amazing. I have heard from many people that I have taught this particular set of content to, that this is a great book. So if you read it, let me know what you think. Okay, so I'm gonna stop here and come back. I'm gonna cut the video. Hold on.